German generals believed for years that Americans were soft shopkeepers who would crumble the moment real war began. They expected an untrained American army that would collapse instantly under the pressure of seasoned German troops. Even veterans of Stalingrad were stunned when American firepower erased entire positions in moments before they could react. Kasserine Pass made Germany certain that American soldiers lacked discipline and would never stand firm in real combat. German officers froze when they saw America's captured supply dumps and realized no amount of skill could beat that scale. This account comes from real wartime documents showing the exact moment Germany understood America fought war differently. 4 years before America entered the war, many officers inside the German high command believed they understood the United States completely. Their intelligence summaries, diplomatic observations, and even pre-war cultural impressions painted America as a nation driven by comfort, commerce, and individualism, not sacrifice, discipline, or long-term endurance. German analysts often describe the U.S. population as materially energetic but militarily indifferent, meaning they believed Americans could build almost anything but wouldn't fight effectively for it. From the perspective of men shaped by Prussian tradition and decades of war theory, it was easy to underestimate a country that hadn't fought a major land war in generations. America's army was small, its officers inexperienced, and its public openly divided on foreign conflict before 1941. But this judgment, though arrogant, wasn't pulled from thin air. German military attaches visiting the U.S. before the war attended training demonstrations and reported that American units lacked field discipline, did not maneuver with European precision, and relied too much on comfort and improvisation rather than doctrine. They regularly compared U.S. maneuvers to the polished drills of German infantry schools and concluded that Americans simply weren't serious about land warfare. These evaluations, recorded in pre-1941 German War Ministry files, formed the foundation of a dangerous assumption. If America ever entered the war, it would take years for their civilian soldiers to become a meaningful fighting force. This was the first major miscalculation. Germany assumed America would remain slow, disorganized, and dependent on others to fight its battles. What they failed to understand was that the United States had a habit of moving slowly at first, but once fully awakened, it could transform itself faster than any other industrial power on Earth. The German High Command would learn this lesson in the harshest possible way. In 1940, the United States was not the superpower it would later become. Its army ranked 17th in the world. Smaller than Portugal's, and many of its tanks and aircraft were outdated even before the first shot of the war reached American shores. U.S. officers trained with wooden rifles, shortage-era equipment, and vehicles that broke down during simple maneuvers. The National Guard, which made up nearly half of America's ground forces, contained enthusiastic volunteers but lacked modern combat experience. German intelligence noted all of this in their year-end assessments and concluded that America simply wasn't built for a fast, mechanized conflict. Yet beneath the surface, something else was happening, something German planners never fully appreciated. American industry, though still peacetime-oriented, possessed an unmatched combination: massive manufacturing capacity, a flexible workforce, and a unique culture of problem-solving. Factories that built cars could be retooled to build tanks. Plants designed for refrigerators could be converted to produce aircraft engines. And the U.S. government understood the value of mass production in a way no European staff college taught. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Roosevelt administration had begun laying the groundwork for weapons contracts, industrial expansion, and emergency reorganization. Most importantly, America had the one resource Germany could never match: distance from the battlefield. While Europe bled, American factories stayed untouched. While Germany struggled under blockades, rationing, and bombed rail lines, the U.S. operated with open seas and enormous internal infrastructure. Germany saw a nation unprepared for war. What they missed was a nation preparing faster than any country in history. And when that preparation collided with the battlefield, the results changed the entire course of the war. In late 1941 and early 1942, German intelligence officers began receiving reports that didn't match their expectations. American shipyards, once considered slow and commercially focused, were suddenly producing Liberty cargo ships at an unprecedented tempo. At first, German analysts dismissed the numbers as propaganda, exaggeration, or statistical errors. No industrialized nation had ever built large ocean-going vessels with such speed. Yet when the intelligence office cross-checked the information with neutral shipping records and international observers, the data remained consistent. Something unusual was happening across the Atlantic. The scale was the true shock. Instead of completing one cargo ship every few months, U.S. yards began completing one every few weeks and later, every few days. Factories operated around the clock, welding prefabricated steel sections with a level of efficiency that German shipyards had never attempted. The famous case of the SS Robert E. Peary, built from keel to launch in just over 4 days, forced German analysts to rewrite their internal assessments. This wasn't just industry working harder, it was industry transforming its entire identity. Inside the German high command, debates erupted. Some believed the Americans were still too inexperienced in combat to matter. Others argued that if these production numbers were accurate, the U.S. would soon outbuild every Axis power combined. The numbers didn't lie. Germany, under constant bombing and restricted resources, couldn't sustain production anywhere near American levels. German officers who studied logistics saw the storm forming. Even if American soldiers lacked combat skill early in the war, the sheer volume of ships, trucks, and aircraft being built would eventually overwhelm any tactical advantage Germany had. For the first time, Berlin realized America wasn't just preparing for war, it was preparing to replace the entire loss of the Allies, month after month, without slowing down. Despite the alarming industrial reports, German frontline officers still believed they held the advantage where it mattered most, the battlefield. They pointed to their victories across Europe. Lightning operations in Poland, crushing France in 6 weeks, and the brutal advance deep into the Soviet Union. In their eyes, American industry could build machines, but it couldn't build the discipline, cohesion, and experience needed to win modern mechanized warfare. German doctrine held that superior training and leadership could overcome enemies with more equipment but less skill. This belief persisted even as American mobilization accelerated. German generals knew the U.S. was raising millions of soldiers, but they assumed these troops would lack the toughness forged in European war. They often pointed to the U.S. Army's outdated pre-war maneuvers, its limited armored doctrine, and its reliance on mass rather than precision. To the German mindset shaped by decades of professional officer education, quantity without quality was meaningless. They believed no nation could train millions of soldiers quickly without sacrificing combat performance. But a shift was happening inside the United States that Germany failed to see. America's training system was not based on tradition, it was based on standardization. Instead of creating elite units over long periods, the U.S. trained entire formations with consistent doctrine, reliable supply chains, and constant reinforcement. The American system wasn't elegant, but it was scalable, and scalable warfare would define the mid-20th century. German tactical brilliance was real, but brilliance cannot be multiplied. American efficiency, on the other hand, could be. Germany expected a slow, uncoordinated enemy. Instead, it would soon face a force that could take losses, rebuild rapidly, and return to battle stronger than before. As 1942 progressed, Liberty ship production forced German intelligence officers to confront a reality their military culture had never imagined. In Europe, building a single ocean-going cargo ship required months of skilled labor, specialized dry docks, and tight naval supervision. Shipyards in Germany, Italy, and occupied France relied on traditional methods: precision cutting, riveting, and detailed craftsmanship. These techniques produced reliable vessels, but at a pace defined by human hands and scarce resources. When the first confirmed report reached Berlin that American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, senior officers dismissed it as an Allied exaggeration. But soon, neutral observers from Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain began reporting identical numbers, making denial impossible. German intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg requested a technical analysis of American shipbuilding methods, and what his analysts discovered was deeply unsettling. The U.S. had replaced artisanal ship construction with industrial assembly, hull sections built in separate plants, welded instead of riveted, moved by rail, and joined at lightning speed. This completely reversed Europe's understanding of naval production. German yards, constrained by fuel shortages, slave labor inefficiency, and bombing raids, simply could not imitate this system. Inside the Kriegsmarine, some officers finally admitted the psychological blow. The U-boat fleet, Germany's last strategic weapon capable of starving Britain, was being nullified not by tactics, but by American factories. Every submarine sunk, every torpedo fired, every daring attack across the Atlantic could be replaced in weeks by U.S. production. Germany realized it was entering a war of replacement, not just destruction, a type of war it had never prepared for. And for the first time, high-ranking officers wondered quietly whether industrial reality had already decided the outcome. While Liberty ships shocked Germany's naval planners, the next industrial revelation struck even deeper: the scale of American aircraft production. In Europe, aircraft manufacturing was a precise, time-consuming craft. German factories like Dornier and Messerschmitt relied on skilled machinists, hand-fitted components, and small-batch assembly. Even before Allied bombing campaigns intensified, Germany struggled to accelerate production without sacrificing quality. Meanwhile, in Michigan, the Ford Motor Company was attempting something no one had ever tried: building heavy bombers on a moving automobile-style assembly line. When German analysts first received reports about the Willow Run plant producing B-24 Liberators at a rate approaching 1 per hour, they refused to believe it. Heavy bombers were among the most complex machines of the era, bristling with engines, hydraulics, wiring, and weapon systems. Building one required careful coordination between thousands of parts. But once again, the numbers were verified through multiple channels. American reporters, neutral diplomats, and captured documents confirmed that Willow Run stretched more than a mile long, fed by dozens of subcontracted factories across the country. No European power, not even Britain at full wartime mobilization, had anything comparable. This industrial capacity had a direct battlefield consequence. Germany began encountering formations of hundreds of Allied bombers escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang, overwhelming Luftwaffe defenses that were already stretched thin. Aircraft destroyed in combat could be replaced by America in weeks. Germany required months. The balance of the air war shifted not only because of pilot skill or tactics, but because the U.S. could saturate the skies with machines faster than Germany could shoot them down. Willow Run didn't just build airplanes, it built air supremacy, and Germany felt its impact from the Ruhr to the Balkans. Before 1942, German armored doctrine relied on a mixture of skilled crews, high-quality engineering, and battlefield coordination. Their tanks, Panzer III, IV, and later the Panther, were mechanically sophisticated but required time, precision machining, and specialized materials. Germany believed tank warfare was a craft. Better steel, better optics, and better commanders would always outperform mass production. That belief held true early in the war, where German armored divisions overwhelmed poorly trained opponents with speed and coordination. But as American industry scaled up, the battlefield changed shape. The United States standardized its tank designs around one model, the M4 Sherman. It wasn't the best tank of the war, and German crews knew it. But the Sherman had advantages. Germany underestimated reliability, simplicity, and ease of production. The U.S. produced over 50,000 Shermans, supported by a replacement system that sent engines, transmissions, turrets, and entire hulls as interchangeable parts. Crews received replacements within days, not weeks. Damaged tanks could be repaired in the field or swapped out completely. This was the opposite of German practice, where a disabled tank often required specialized factory repairs, skilled mechanics, and scarce spare parts. German reports from the Eastern and Western fronts show mounting frustration. Even when German tanks destroyed multiple Shermans, more always arrived. A Panther lost in battle represented months of work. A Sherman lost represented a line item in America's industrial budget. German officers complained that U.S. armored units returned to full strength faster than they could be reduced. The problem wasn't quality, it was tempo. Germany could win local tank duels, but America could win the war of regeneration, and that difference shaped every battle from Normandy to the Ardennes. In February 1943, Germany finally faced the U.S. Army on the ground in North Africa. At Kasserine Pass, American forces collapsed under experienced German units commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. German intelligence celebrated the victory as proof that their pre-war assumptions were right. American soldiers were green, poorly coordinated, and unprepared for modern combined arms combat. Reports from the Africa Corps described U.S. units retreating in confusion, abandoning new equipment, and failing to hold defensive positions under pressure. For German commanders, this was exactly what they had expected. But what Germany didn't anticipate was how the United States responded to failure. After the defeat, the The U.S. Army initiated one of the fastest learning curves in military history. Command structures were reorganized, officers replaced, equipment improved, and training methods rewritten. American units that returned to the line only weeks later showed dramatic improvement in maneuvering, communication, and battlefield discipline. German intelligence files from mid-1943 noted with concern that U.S. forces no longer repeated the same tactical mistakes. Most importantly, America's logistical system allowed rapid reinforcement and re-equipping. Losses at Kasserine were replaced quickly. Ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies, and vehicles arrived continuously. The U.S. Army returned with greater firepower and better coordination, while German units in North Africa struggled with dwindling supplies, fuel shortages, and a collapsing strategic position. Kasserine gave Germany false confidence. They believed American weakness was permanent, not temporary. But America's strength was never in flawless tactics. It was in rapid adaptation and endless capacity. The defeat that convinced Germany of American incompetence would ultimately mark the beginning of a far more formidable opponent than they imagined. When American forces entered Normandy after D-Day, German commanders expected familiar terrain fighting, disciplined infantry, tight ambushes, and small unit tactics that had served them across Europe. The hedgerows, thick, ancient walls of earth and vegetation, favored the defender. German units used them as natural bunkers, placing machine guns and mortars in hidden gaps. Early American units struggled, advancing slowly and suffering losses. To German observers, it looked like Kasserine all over again, inexperienced troops failing to maneuver under fire. But within days, the Germans realized the Americans approached combat differently. Instead of frontal charges or complex squad tactics, U.S. platoon leaders used radios to call escalating waves of firepower. A single hidden machine gun nest could trigger mortars, 105mm howitzers, or even naval gunfire from battleships in the Channel. German positions that normally required prolonged fighting were obliterated in minutes. Luftwaffe pilots noted with shock that American artillery operated as if unlimited, firing barrages so heavy that German units sometimes withdrew without engaging. Captured German reports described frustration. The Americans do not fight with infantry. They fight with artillery. U.S. doctrine emphasized overwhelming force rather than elegant tactics. Ammunition dumps stocked with millions of shells enabled American commanders to solve battlefield problems through firepower instead of manpower. German commanders, bound by strict rationing, saw this as wasteful but devastating. In the hedgerows, U.S. engineers also displayed surprising innovation. They welded steel prongs known as rhino devices onto Sherman tanks, allowing them to burst through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. This adaptation stunned German defenders, who suddenly lost their natural advantage. The hedgerow battles taught Germany that American weakness didn't stay weakness for long. Once the U.S. understood the battlefield's demands, it reshaped the environment itself. One of the most demoralizing discoveries for German commanders after Normandy was the sheer scale of American supply. German doctrine prized efficiency. Every bullet counted, every shell budgeted, every liter of fuel planned. Supply officers measured the success of an operation by how well they conserved resources. In contrast, American doctrine viewed logistics not as something to manage, but something to unleash. German units that captured or stumbled upon American supply dumps described scenes that defied European military logic. Mountains of ammunition crates, piles of food that could feed divisions for days, hundreds of spare tank parts stacked outdoors, and rows of brand new trucks. Even in areas recently under fire. One German colonel wrote in frustration that American supply levels violated every principle of economy, yet gave U.S. troops a constant operational edge. If a unit ran low, replacements arrived within hours. If a vehicle broke down, it was repaired or swapped without delay. Meanwhile, German supply chains collapsed under Allied bombing. Factories struggled to meet demands. Horse-drawn wagons still carried most supplies across France. While American divisions moved fuel, ammunition, and equipment along paved roads in thousands of motorized vehicles, German units relied on horses exhausted from long marches. This created an unforgiving dynamic. American forces kept advancing, firing, and re-equipping, while German divisions fought harder but grew weaker with every passing day. To German commanders in the field, the conclusion became clear. They weren't fighting an army limited by terrain or supply, they were fighting a nation whose logistics were built to overpower nature, distance, and resistance. The battlefield was no longer a contest of tactics alone. It was a contest of endurance, and America's supply machine never tired. By mid-1944, German commanders began noticing something they had never seen on any front: the complete absence of horses in the American army. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation for mechanized blitzkrieg, still relied on more than 500,000 horses for moving supplies, artillery, and equipment. Their famed divisions were only partly motorized. Even elite panzer-grenadier units often lacked enough trucks to move their full strength at once. This was not a failure of planning. Germany simply did not have the industrial base or fuel reserves to replace horses with engines. In contrast, every American formation was fully motorized. Every infantry regiment had trucks. Every artillery battery had tractors. Every engineer unit had specialized vehicles for bridges, mines, timber, and demolition. German observers were stunned to see U.S. divisions move 50 to 100 miles in a single day, repositioning with a speed Germany couldn't match even under ideal conditions. When German divisions marched that distance, they arrived exhausted, their horses weak, their equipment damaged from the strain. Americans arrived fresh and ready to fight. This difference reshaped operational warfare. German forces often planned counterattacks expecting days before American units could reinforce a breakthrough. Instead, U.S. armored columns appeared overnight, sealed gaps, and launched their own attacks before Germany could reposition. German communications recorded anger and disbelief. The Americans move as if distance does not exist. It wasn't magic, it was fuel, trucks, spare parts, and a system designed for movement. Mechanization didn't just give America speed. It gave America adaptability. When German defenses crumbled, U.S. forces swept through open terrain, outrunning German planners and disorienting commanders who were used to slower, predictable enemy movements. The battlefield no longer moved at marching pace, it moved at engine pace, and Germany couldn't keep up. While Germany struggled with logistics, another disaster unfolded silently: its strategic blindness. The Allies, through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park, were reading large portions of German encrypted communications. American and British analysts intercepted operational plans, reinforcement schedules, and supply shortages. This allowed Allied commanders to anticipate German offensives, strengthen weak points, and even time their operations around German vulnerabilities. The Germans didn't know how Allied forces reacted so quickly. They assumed luck, not intelligence. American field units also benefited from rapid intelligence sharing. Radio intercept teams, aerial reconnaissance, and frontline observers built a constant picture of German movements. Reports were passed to artillery, armor, and air support with astonishing speed. German units often walked into ambushes without knowing the Allies had intercepted their orders hours earlier. In contrast, German intelligence suffered from fragmentation. Fuel shortages limited aerial reconnaissance. Allied bombing disrupted command networks. And overconfidence led many German commanders to underestimate American analytical capabilities. As a result, Germany repeatedly launched counterattacks into positions the Allies had already reinforced, or attempted withdrawals that Allied forces intercepted with perfect timing. Ultra didn't just reveal Germany's weaknesses, it amplified them. American forces used precise intelligence to compensate for inexperience, enabling them to strike accurately even when terrain or tactics were unfamiliar. German commanders expressed confusion in their war diaries: the enemy reacts with impossible speed. They never fully understood that their plans were often known before their own units received them. By late 1944, Germany wasn't just outnumbered or outbuilt, it was outmaneuvered mentally. America's combination of intelligence, communication, and rapid adaptation created a battlefield environment where German initiatives simply could not survive. In July 1944, after weeks of grinding combat in the Normandy hedgerows, the Americans prepared a breakthrough operation the Germans did not believe possible. Known as Operation Cobra, it would demonstrate the full, terrifying weight of American industrial warfare. The plan relied on something Germany could not match: an overwhelming concentration of heavy and medium bombers delivering precision saturation attacks across a narrow front. German commanders were accustomed to artillery barrages, but what they faced during Cobra was a bombardment unlike anything in European history. Thousands of American bombers, including B-17s and B-24s, carpet-bombed German defensive positions with such intensity that entire sections of the front line simply ceased to exist. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored units, was shattered in hours. Survivors reported being physically thrown into the air by explosions, their tanks flipped, communications destroyed, and cohesion obliterated. German war diaries describe soldiers found days later wandering in shock, unable to hear or speak. It wasn't just an attack, it was an industrial-sized erasure. As the dust settled, American armored divisions surged forward with speed that stunned German commanders. Instead of carefully clearing each hedgerow, U.S. forces bypassed strongpoints, leaving them isolated for air power and infantry to finish later. This was warfare at a new tempo, fast, flexible, and backed by endless fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. The Germans attempted counterattacks, but each effort collapsed under rapid U.S. airstrikes and artillery coordination. Operation Cobra broke more than the German front, it broke German assumptions. For the first time, senior officers admitted that American strategy no longer resembled traditional European warfare. This was industrial tempo combat, and Germany's system, exhausted, undersupplied, and undermanned, had no answer for it. After Operation Cobra opened the lines, the American advance across France transformed into what historians call the Great Pursuit. A phase of the war where U.S. mechanized power moved at speeds Germany had never confronted. American armored divisions raced through gaps, often covering 50 to 70 miles per day, destroying supply depots, cutting railways, and overrunning German command posts before they could relocate. What Germany saw as reckless, America saw as momentum, and momentum was a weapon. The German dilemma was devastatingly simple. Fuel shortages, horse-drawn logistics, and broken communication networks made rapid repositioning impossible. When German high command planned a defensive line along the Seine, they estimated it would take Americans at least a week to gather bridging equipment and move forces forward. But American combat engineers proved them wrong. Working day and night, often under fire, U.S. units constructed pontoon bridges in hours. Entire armored divisions rolled across before German reinforcements even reached the river. German commanders described their frustration in captured reports. They planned counterattacks only to learn the Americans had moved again. They established defensive lines only to discover U.S. tanks already behind them. They attempted retreats, but American columns intercepted them using superior radio coordination and reconnaissance. German officers wrote that American movements defied terrain and expectation, highlighting the deep contrast between German planning cycles and American improvisational speed. What Germany misunderstood was that American mobility wasn't chaotic, it was supported by a relentless logistics system. Truck convoys, maintenance teams, fuel depots, and field repair units kept the advance alive. Every mile the Americans gained weakened Germany's already fragile supply chain. The pursuit phase was not just a collapse of German lines, it was the collapse of an entire strategic worldview. As American forces pushed deeper into France after the breakout, the biggest challenge they faced wasn't German resistance. It was distance. Armored divisions were advancing faster than supplies could naturally follow. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food had to cross hundreds of miles of ruined roads, destroyed bridges, and unpredictable terrain. Any other army would have been forced to slow down. Germany expected exactly that. But the United States created something new, a logistical superhighway known as the Red Ball Express. Operating 24 hours a day, the Red Ball Express consisted of thousands of trucks, mostly the reliable GMC Deuce and a half, driven by soldiers who worked on almost no sleep. More than 70% of the drivers were African American troops from quartermaster units, men who received little recognition at the time but kept the Allied advance alive. Trucks moved in constant convoys, headlights blacked out, engines roaring through night and fog. Mechanics worked roadside repairs on the spot, using cannibalized parts and improvisation to keep vehicles running. German commanders who later reviewed captured footage and reports struggled to comprehend the scale. Their own supply columns still depended heavily on horses, lacked fuel, and suffered under Allied air attacks. Meanwhile, the Red Ball Express delivered up to 12,000 tons of supplies per day, enabling American divisions to maintain momentum that should have been impossible. Even when bridges collapsed or roads turned to mud, engineers rerouted traffic in hours, not days. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply system, it was the beating heart of the Allied advance. It allowed American units to operate at full power, regardless of distance from the coast. 4 German planners accustomed to strict rationing and predictable supply limits, this endless flow of material shattered the last illusion that the United States could be slowed by logistics. By late 1944, the difference in manpower systems between the US and Germany became glaringly clear. German units were exhausted. Many soldiers had been fighting continuously since 1941, serving on multiple fronts with almost no rest. Veteran formations, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were worn down by casualties, frostbite, malnutrition, and constant retreats. Replacements were scarce and often undertrained, sometimes rushed into battle with only days of preparation. German officers begged for rest cycles their systems simply could not provide. Meanwhile, the United States operated on the principle of rotation and replenishment. When infantry divisions suffered heavy losses, replacement battalions were immediately integrated, restoring combat strength within days. Critically, America rotated experienced troops out of the front lines to train new recruits. This created a cycle where battlefield wisdom was preserved rather than lost. German commanders were stunned to see American divisions return to the front after a major battle, appearing almost entirely rebuilt, new vehicles, new artillery, fresh uniforms, and rested personnel. This difference created a psychological split on the battlefield. German soldiers saw their units shrinking, their veterans disappearing, and their equipment breaking down without replacement. American soldiers, by contrast, saw broken units reconstituted, trucks repaired overnight, and supply lines that never stopped delivering. German war diaries recorded bitterness. "We are fighting machines with men who never tire." They weren't exaggerating. America's manpower and replacement system maintained pressure day after day, while Germany's manpower system crumbled under the weight of a multi-front war. By winter, the imbalance was undeniable. Germany fought with what it had left. America fought with what it could always replace. By late 1944, something began appearing repeatedly in captured German letters, interrogation reports, and frontline diaries. Frustration, disbelief, and eventually fear. German soldiers, many of them veterans of brutal Eastern Front battles, started describing the U.S. Army not as a traditional opponent, but as a machine. They didn't mean this metaphorically. What shocked them was the seemingly endless American ability to deliver firepower, supplies, and reinforcements with mechanical consistency. It felt inhuman. German platoon leaders wrote that fighting the Red Army meant facing massed infantry assaults, but fighting the Americans meant being crushed by an industrial rhythm. If a machine gun position survived the first barrage, a second came. If it survived the artillery, air support arrived. If it survived air support, tanks appeared. Every hour that passed brought a new wave of coordinated fire and fresh units. German defenders, pinned for days with dwindling ammunition, realized the Americans weren't relying on heroics. They were relying on systems. This psychological pressure grew heavier as German troops noticed differences in daily life. American soldiers received hot meals near the front, fresh uniforms, chocolate, cigarettes, and medical supplies that Germany couldn't dream of providing so late in the war. Every U.S. casualty received quick evacuation and treatment. German casualties often remained in the open, untreated, due to lack of transport and medical shortages. American soldiers rotated regularly. Germans stayed until collapse. From a German soldier's perspective, America's strength felt unstoppable not because of bravery or aggression, but because America could erase every loss, replace every tank, and replenish every shell. Fighting a system like that drained morale faster than any defeat. By winter, many Germans privately believed the war was no longer winnable, not because of tactics, but because the opponent never tired. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate but brilliantly planned gamble. Using secrecy, bad weather, and their last reserves of armor, the Germans smashed into thin American lines in the Ardennes, creating a massive bulge in the front. Early gains were impressive. They seized towns, captured supplies, and surrounded units. To many in Berlin, this looked like 1940 all over again, the rebirth of Blitzkrieg. But Germany miscalculated American resilience. Units like the 101st Airborne, surrounded in Bastogne with freezing temperatures and minimal supplies, refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, General McAuliffe sent back a single word: nuts. This stunned German officers, who expected the Americans to collapse under encirclement. Instead, U.S. forces dug in, held their ground, and waited. Then weather cleared and American logistics roared back to life. Waves of Allied aircraft hammered German columns, destroying fuel convoys, tanks, and supply routes. Patton executed one of the fastest operational pivots in military history, turning his entire Third Army 90 degrees in 2 days and smashing into the German flank. No European army, German or Soviet, had ever maneuvered with such speed. Germany's problem wasn't courage. Their soldiers fought with impressive determination. But they ran out of fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and replacements. Many of their best tanks were abandoned simply because they couldn't move. American units, meanwhile, replaced losses rapidly and kept pressure constant. The bulge wasn't just Germany's last offensive, it was the moment Germany learned American resilience wasn't a weakness. It was the backbone of an industrial system that Germany could no longer match. By early 1945, the German High Command began receiving reports so grim and repetitive that even the most optimistic staff officers could no longer deny reality. Every defensive success, every tactical victory, and every temporary breakthrough cost Germany resources it could never replace. Meanwhile, every American setback was temporary. Divisions mauled in battle reappeared fully rebuilt within weeks. Panzer brigades shattered by airstrikes never returned. The math alone began breaking Germany's strategic confidence. High-ranking generals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian studied daily casualty charts and reinforcement tables. Their staff calculated tank losses, fuel shortages, artillery expenditure, and infantry depletion. What terrified them wasn't American bravery. It was American durability. U.S. factories replaced aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Tank plants replaced Shermans faster than Panthers could destroy them. The American replacement system fed infinite manpower into reconstituted divisions, while Germany sent teenagers and elderly men into the line with single-use weapons and minimal training. Worst of all was fuel. German armored warfare, the very soul of blitzkrieg, died from starvation. Allied bombing had crippled synthetic fuel plants, U-boat losses severed supply lines, and the Eastern Front consumed what little remained. Meanwhile, American forces consumed fuel with the confidence of a nation that had more than enough. Patton himself wrote that his greatest advantage wasn't guns or tanks, it was gasoline. Internal German documents revealed an uncomfortable truth. No tactical brilliance could defeat an opponent whose losses didn't matter. Officers who once believed victory depended on courage and discipline now admitted the war was being decided in factories, not trenches. For a military built on centuries of martial identity, this realization was the final psychological blow. The Luftwaffe entered the war as one of the most advanced air forces in the world, but by 1944-45, it had deteriorated into a shadow of its former strength. Germany's problems were layered: fuel shortages, pilot training failures, aircraft production bottlenecks, and relentless Allied bombing. Meanwhile, the United States unleashed thousands of fighters and bombers with a consistency that stunned German commanders. The skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to American industry. Training was one of the primary reasons. Early in the war, Germany produced highly skilled fighter pilots through long, intensive courses. But as casualties mounted and resources dwindled, training was shortened drastically. New pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had. American pilots, in contrast, trained in safe conditions with abundant fuel and modern aircraft, receiving hundreds of hours before facing the enemy. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe further. Even veteran pilots couldn't train, losing sharpness between missions. Some units received just enough fuel for takeoff and landing drills, nothing more. When American long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang began accompanying bombers deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe simply couldn't match them. Skilled pilots were gone, new ones were unprepared, and aircraft production couldn't keep up with losses. For German ground forces, the collapse of the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Every daylight movement risked detection. Supply convoys were destroyed before reaching the front. Reinforcing units were bombed on the march. Bridges, rail lines, depots, nothing survived long enough to matter. American air superiority became a weapon that attacked everything Germany needed to fight. By early 1945, German commanders had to admit the truth. The sky itself had turned against them, and with it, the war. By March 1945, Germany expected the Rhine River to slow the Allies for weeks. The Rhine wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a psychological one. German commanders saw it as their last natural defense line, a river historically associated with protection of the German heartland. Bridges were blown, cities were fortified, and Wehrmacht engineers prepared to fight for every crossing. German staff estimated that the Allies would need significant time to assemble bridging equipment, position artillery, and secure riverbanks. But once again, the Americans defied German expectations. The first shock came when the U.S. 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. To German disbelief, American tanks and infantry poured across before demolition charges could fully destroy it. German officers called it a catastrophic stroke of luck. But what came next proved it was more than chance. American combat engineers, some of the most efficient in military history, constructed additional pontoon bridges in record time. Working under artillery fire, they used modular components, pre-cut materials, and standardized designs to build floating and fixed bridges in a matter of hours. German intelligence reports described the speed as impossible. They believed the Rhine would hold for at least a month. Instead, American forces were crossing within days. What stunned the Germans further was the scale of protection the U.S. Army could bring. Anti-aircraft guns, smoke generators, artillery umbrellas, and dedicated repair teams kept the crossings functional despite repeated Luftwaffe attacks. When the Luftwaffe attempted to bomb the Remagen Bridge, many aircraft lacked fuel to reach the target or were intercepted by American fighters long before arrival. The Rhine crossing broke the last German hope of prolonging the war. It demonstrated that even Germany's natural defenses couldn't withstand America's combination of engineering speed, industrial strength, and air dominance. The heartland was now exposed. As American forces advanced beyond the Rhine, the German war machine entered total collapse. This breakdown wasn't caused by a single battle. It was the accumulation of every structural disadvantage Germany had faced since 1941. Factories lay in ruins from relentless Allied bombing. Rail networks were shattered. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Units that once prided themselves on discipline and precision were now hollow formations of exhausted veterans and undertrained conscripts. American divisions encountered pockets of resistance, but these were increasingly uncoordinated. German commanders lacked the means to maneuver, reinforce, or even communicate effectively. The once formidable Wehrmacht could no longer assemble large-scale operations. Instead, fragmented battle groups fought isolated engagements, often unaware of the broader situation. Some units ran out of ammunition mid-battle. Others abandoned vehicles because they had no fuel. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized the war was unwinnable. Meanwhile, American forces continued operating with a level of logistical confidence unmatched in the conflict. Supply trucks brought food, ammunition, and medical care right to the front line. Field hospitals treated casualties quickly. Engineers rebuilt bridges faster than German forces could demolish them. Air superiority ensured that American columns moved across open country with minimal threat. The contrast between the two armies, one collapsing, one accelerating, became impossible to ignore. German diaries from early 1945 reveal the emotional shift. Soldiers wrote of being overwhelmed by American resources, describing U.S. units as tireless, endless, and mechanical. Commanders admitted privately that the war had been lost long before, but in these final months, the scale of American advantage stripped away any remaining doubt. Germany had entered the war believing discipline and experience would defeat material power. By 1945, they understood that industrial capability combined with relentless logistics was the new definition of military strength. As the war neared its end, the most honest insights didn't come from generals in Berlin. They came from German soldiers writing secretly to their families. Censors intercepted thousands of letters, and after the war, many were examined by historians. What they revealed shocked the world. Frontline troops no longer feared American soldiers individually. What they feared was the system that supported them. German infantrymen repeatedly described American firepower as unending, merciless, and without pause. They wrote that U.S. artillery fired with such consistency that it felt mechanical. One soldier near Aachen wrote that American barrages arrived with the rhythm of a factory machine. Another, fighting in the Hürtgen forest, complained bitterly that the enemy has more shells than we have thoughts. These weren't exaggerated statements, they were the lived experiences of men whose supply lines had crumbled. Soldiers also noted the difference in treatment of wounded. American medics had vehicles, drugs, dressings, and evacuation routes. German medics had dwindling supplies and no transport. Letters describe wounded comrades lying for hours, sometimes days, because there were no means to move them. The comparison devastated morale. A German corporal wrote, "They save every man. We save only those who can walk." Then came the shock of American rest cycles. Germans fought until they broke physically or mentally. Americans rotated out, cleaned up, ate hot meals, and returned restored. Captured German soldiers openly admitted that U.S. rest and replacement policies were more frightening than American tanks. It meant the enemy could never be exhausted. These letters revealed what German leadership rarely admitted publicly: the contradiction between their early war arrogance and the late war reality. By spring 1945, even ordinary German soldiers understood they were facing a nation whose resources and will to use them were beyond anything Europe had ever seen. As Germany's military position collapsed, senior commanders began submitting final operational reports that historians still study today. These reports are remarkably candid, far more honest than wartime propaganda or public statements. They reveal the exact moment German leadership collectively realized the war was lost. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring reported that American mobility and firepower negated all principles of defensive warfare. His staff wrote that U.S. logistics made it impossible to create stable front lines. Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most respected commanders, stated plainly that the Americans' ability to replace losses renders the destruction of their formations operationally meaningless. In other words, even when German units fought well, the results didn't matter. General Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg, emphasized fuel shortages as the decisive factor. He warned Hitler that without fuel, tanks were merely expensive bunkers. His reports describe how American control of air and supply routes eliminated the possibility of any German counteroffensive. Guderian didn't blame German soldiers, he blamed arithmetic. Perhaps most striking were the psychological assessments. In a late war briefing, German officers admitted that the American Army's strength lay not in superior soldiers, but superior systems. They wrote that the U.S. military functioned like an industrial organism, where each part, logistics, intelligence, engineering, artillery, medicine, supported every other with flawless consistency. Germany, stretched across collapsing fronts, simply could not match that integration. Their final conclusion was brutal and simple. Germany had lost the war long before Berlin fell. The moment American industry reached full mobilization, the outcome became inevitable. German commanders didn't surrender to American tactics, they surrendered to American capacity. One of the least discussed but most decisive advantages the U.S. Army possessed was its medical and recovery system. German commanders were stunned to learn, often through captured documents, that American wounded soldiers had a significantly higher chance of survival and returning to duty. This mattered because war is not only about numbers. It is about preserving experienced fighters. Germany, battered by resource shortages and chaotic front lines, lost many men not because their wounds were fatal, but because there was no way to treat them properly. American divisions operated with mobile surgical hospitals, well-equipped ambulances, and trained medical personnel who had abundant access to plasma, morphine, antibiotics, and bandages. Evacuation procedures were standardized. A wounded soldier typically reached a treatment center within an hour. German diaries expressed disbelief at how quickly Americans reappeared on the battlefield. Men who would have died in Wehrmacht units were returning to fight days or weeks later. German units lacked vehicles for evacuation, lacked medicines, and lacked the infrastructure to stabilize casualties. Even elite formations often had to leave wounded behind during retreats. In many cases, medics used horse carts or makeshift sleds to move the injured, and sometimes they simply couldn't. A German lieutenant wrote, "We lose twice. One man to the bullet, and one to the wound we cannot treat." Meanwhile, American commanders tracked casualty rates and adjusted operations to keep units healthy. Germany had no such luxury. As manpower dwindled, medical staff were stretched thin, supply lines collapsed, and treatment became improvisational at best. By 1945, Germany's manpower was bleeding out faster than it could be replaced. America, by contrast, treated its men as a long-term investment, saving every soldier possible and keeping divisions strong. This system, invisible to the casual observer, quietly shaped the outcome of the war. As the Allied advance pushed deeper into the Reich, Germany's internal infrastructure, already strained by years of war, began to break apart completely. The railway system, once the backbone of German strategic mobility, had been crippled by relentless Allied bombing. Bridges lay in ruins, key junctions were flattened, and repair crews lacked both material and manpower. Entire lines were reduced to twisted steel. Even when equipment existed, fuel shortages prevented locomotives from operating at full schedules. American intelligence understood this weakness well. Ultra-intercepts revealed timing vulnerabilities and supply shortfalls. Bombing campaigns were directed to choke points, creating cascading failures. German units waiting for ammunition or replacements often received nothing. In some areas, trains stopped miles away from the front, forcing exhausted soldiers to march the remaining distance. Road traffic fared no better. Germany lacked the motor pool required to shift entire divisions quickly, especially with fuel rationed to critical units only. Many vehicles sat immobile, cannibalized for parts. Horses struggled in winter mud and ice, slowing movement further. American forces, observing this collapse, exploited it ruthlessly. Fast-moving armored and mechanized columns bypassed strong points, cut supply lines, and isolated German formations before they could regroup. Inside German cities, infrastructure collapsed under the weight of refugees, wounded soldiers, and fleeing civilians. Water, electricity, and food distribution systems faltered. The Reich was fighting without the basic foundation needed to wage war. American and British bombers hit marshalling yards, factories, chemical plants, and oil refineries, severing Germany's ability to sustain its armies. By early 1945, the German military machine wasn't defeated by a single battle, it was defeated by the destruction of the system that kept it alive. Without infrastructure, the Wehrmacht was reduced to scattered pockets of resistance fighting an enemy whose supply lines were stronger than ever. By 1945, German propaganda could no longer mask the truth. The reports broadcast on radio stations and printed in newspapers spoke of strategic withdrawals and heroic resistance. But every soldier at the front knew reality. Their army was collapsing under forces no nation in Europe could match. Morale deteriorated rapidly, not because of cowardice, but because German troops saw every single day how different the American war machine was from anything their commanders had promised. German officers tried to maintain discipline, but the emotional strain was overwhelming. Soldiers arriving from the West described American artillery that fired for hours without pausing, armored units that replaced destroyed tanks in days, and supply columns that stretched farther than they could see. In contrast, German soldiers received rationed ammunition, dwindling medical support, and increasingly scarce food. Propaganda had told them Americans were soft and unprepared. But the men they fought were well-fed, well-supplied, and backed by a system that functioned with terrifying consistency. The psychological break deepened as units stopped receiving mail, pay, or reliable orders. Communications failed, fuel ran out, and many formations operated blind. Soldiers who tried to retreat were often overtaken by faster American mechanized units. Some were captured before they ever rejoined their parent divisions. For many, surrender became less an act of defeat and more an act of survival. By spring, even elite units like the Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, once considered among Germany's toughest fighters, reported that morale was collapsing due to material hopelessness. They wrote that it felt like fighting a nation with infinite reserves. Morale didn't collapse because German soldiers lacked courage. It collapsed because courage alone can't fight factories, fuel, organization, and the constant weight of an enemy that never stopped coming. When morale fell, Germany lost more than battles, it lost the will to continue a war already decided by industrial reality. As historians review wartime documents, one conclusion emerges clearly. Germany entered World War II with the wrong assumptions about how modern conflict would be fought. Their ideology emphasized elite warriors, discipline, and lightning operations. Their industrial strategy relied on early victories and rapid expansion of captured resources. But this worldview failed completely when confronted by a nation capable of sustained, high-tempo industrial warfare. American industry didn't rely on ideology. It relied on systems. Assembly lines, standardized parts, interchangeable engines, and nationwide coordination allowed the U.S. to manufacture weapons at unprecedented scales. Germany continued producing complex designs like the Panther and Tiger, machines that were technologically impressive but resource-hungry and slow to build. The Americans, by contrast, focused on what could be built quickly, repaired easily, and replaced immediately. Ideology also shaped manpower in different ways. Germany relied on training elite units, believing quality could overcome quantity. But as casualties mounted, this philosophy unraveled. Replacements lacked experience, and veteran soldiers couldn't be rotated out. America's system, built on training centers, standardized doctrine, and consistent rotation, kept divisions fresh and capable. The contrast between the two nations wasn't moral, it was structural. America's decentralized industrial culture encouraged innovation and flexibility. Germany's authoritarian system restricted experimentation, slowed decision-making, and punished failure harshly, which discouraged initiative. The U.S. mobilized women, immigrants, and minority workers into the industrial workforce. Germany refused to utilize millions of potential workers because of ideological prejudice. By 1945, ideology had become Germany's greatest strategic weakness. While Germany clung to outdated concepts of martial superiority, America embraced the future of warfare: mass production, rapid adaptation, and logistical dominance. The result was inevitable. The nation that valued systems over slogans won the war that defined the century. By the final months of the war, the German High Command no longer viewed American success as a series of isolated advantages. They began to understand, fully and painfully, the interconnected structure behind every American battlefield victory. It wasn't just tanks or planes or manpower or logistics. It was all of them combined, functioning like a single, unified organism. German generals who once mocked American shopkeepers now studied U.S. operations with a mix of respect and dread. Captured reports show senior Wehrmacht strategists identifying 5 decisive American strengths: industrial output, mechanization, logistics, intelligence integration, and rapid reinforcement. Individually, Germany could challenge some of these elements, but together they formed a system Germany could never replicate. For every German tank destroyed, America produced 5. For every Luftwaffe aircraft lost, America produced 10. For every German battalion exhausted, an American battalion was refreshed, supplied, and ready to advance. American operations also became increasingly synchronized. Artillery, armor, engineers, infantry, and air support worked in near-perfect coordination. To German eyes, this looked less like human tactical genius and more like industrial engineering applied to war. They called it material warfare, a type of conflict where precision, reliability, and abundance mattered more than ancient ideas of courage and sacrifice. Germany's final internal assessments admitted something no propaganda could hide. The United States had reinvented warfare. The battlefield no longer rewarded tradition, it rewarded systems thinking, standardized production, and uninterrupted supply. Once German generals saw the full scope of this machine, they knew defeat was inevitable. Not because they lacked bravery, but because bravery can't replace fuel, steel, and time. By spring 1945, Germany understood they hadn't been fighting an army. They had been fighting an entire industrial nation moving with one purpose. By the time American troops approached the Elbe River, the German High Command had reached a conclusion none of them wanted to admit. They had completely misjudged what modern war had become. Early in the conflict, Germany believed warfare was defined by superior leadership, elite soldiers, and bold maneuvers. But American actions in 1944-45 shattered that belief. The United States demonstrated that victory in the modern age belonged to the nation that could mobilize its entire society. Its factories, its engineers, its scientists, its economy, and its people into a coordinated war effort. American soldiers fought well, but their greatest strength was the system behind them. Every tank they drove, every shell they fired, every ration they ate, and every bridge they crossed was backed by a supply chain so vast that German generals compared it to a force of nature. America had turned war into a large-scale industrial process, something Germany's leadership had never imagined. In their post-war interrogations, several high-ranking German officers admitted that once American industry fully mobilized, the war was already lost. The final realization struck hardest when German officers compared casualty replacements. Germany's elite units had been destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again until they existed only on paper. America's units, by contrast, kept returning with fresh troops, restored equipment, and consistent morale. Even when Americans suffered losses, those losses held no long-term strategic meaning. Germany had gambled on a short, decisive war. America had prepared for a long, sustainable one. The difference proved fatal. When German commanders finally accepted this truth, Berlin was already burning. They understood the real story of the war. America didn't win because it fought harder. America won because it fought differently. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, the ruins across Europe told one story. But the documents left behind inside German headquarters told another, a deeper, more revealing one. As Allied investigators pored through planning rooms, decrypted messages, production logs, and commanders' final reports, they discovered something extraordinary. Germany hadn't been defeated by a single battle or a single campaign or even a single nation. Germany had been defeated by a new idea of war, one built not on tradition, but on transformation. In the years that followed, German officers interviewed by Allied historians admitted a truth that surprised even their captors. They said the most dangerous thing about America wasn't its soldiers or its tanks, it was its ability to change. No other nation in the war adapted so quickly, learned so consistently, or mobilized so completely. America's strength came from the belief that war was not just fought at the front, but across the entire nation. In factories, farms, laboratories, logistics hubs, rail yards, and shipyards. This was the lesson many German officers carried into the post-war world. They wrote that modern war would never again be won by the boldness of a few, but by the coordination of millions. They learned that firepower mattered, but so did fuel. Courage mattered, but so did communication. Discipline mattered, but so did the ability to produce, replace, and recover faster than the enemy could destroy. For Germany, this understanding came too late. For America, it became the blueprint for the modern military age. And for us, looking back today, this story is more than history. It's a reminder of how nations rise, how they adapt, and how, in the most critical moments, the shape of victory is defined not just by the battlefield, but by the world behind it.